All right. Welcome everybody to part two of Tending the Garden, Covenant and Creation in the Bible with Dr. John Daniels. Uh, we're going to be continuing this with the Zoom format. So if you're just joining us, there's a couple ways to interact. We do invite your questions, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation. But if you'd like to ask a question, two ways you can do that. You can click on the chat icon below. That'll allow you to type in a question that we can respond to later on. As well as a Q&A section. If you click on the Q&A button, what that will allow you to do is to enter your question. Then any other attendees, if they see a question that's relevant to them or that's something that they would ask too, you can actually upvote the question so we can see which ones are most relevant. So you can communicate either way, either through the chat or using the Q&A feature. But without any further ado then, let's jump right into part two of Tending the Garden with Dr. John Daniels. Thank you, Doc.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I am happy to be back again to talk with you about tending the garden, covenant, and creation in the Bible. Last week, we spent a little time with the creation narratives, Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 2 through 3, and then I added Genesis 6 through 9, especially portions of the text in chapter 9. So what I want to do today, well, before I start, I want to go ahead and offer a summary to kind of recall for those of us who were there and those of us who weren't there to get an idea of what we actually covered. First thing that we talked about was the fact that creation, the creation of beauty, abundance, and peace is what characterizes God's creation in chapters 1 and 2. There's no hurting and killing in God's peaceable kingdom. Humanity is integrally connected to all of creation, fashioned from the earth itself. The name Adam is actually a derivative of the Hebrew word Adamah. Adamah means earth or land or ground or soil. And so Adam's very name refers to where he comes from. He comes from the same place that all other living things, according to the second creation narrative, where they come from the ground. Humans are given dominion over creation, to lord it over creation with loving care, patience, mercy, to ensure its continued generativity. It's an important distinction to understand dominion in the Hebrew Bible this way, rather than in the way that dominion has come to be understood since the Enlightenment in the Industrial Age, where the word dominate is a good descriptor of what has been going on. Covenant infidelity or sin results in distorted dominion, according to the creation stories, and the possibility of the undoing of God's very creation. And this is a fifth one that I added for tonight's presentation. Human sinfulness, according to Genesis 1, is characterized by a fundamental self-centeredness, asserting ourselves as being like God, but without God, before God, and not in accordance with God. So I'm going to want to focus tonight on this idea of self-centeredness and self-assertion that is part and parcel with human interaction with the creation. That's how I left it there. Now, before we get into the Psalms tonight, what I want to do is just sort of revisit one question that I was thinking a little bit about over the course of the week. Someone asked a question that is something like the one that you see up on the screen. Aren't we humans causing the undoing of creation? Probably the reason why that question came up in the viewer's mind is because last week's discussion was about God undoing God's creation in response to Torah breaking on the part of human beings, and sometimes creation undoing itself in response to Torah infidelity on the part of human beings. And also, just because of this thing called tohu vavohu, which is the recalcitrant, squirrely stuff that God gets a hold of, according to the Hebrew Bible, grabs a hold of and shapes and controls to create. So I understand the question as being, aren't we humans causing the undoing of creation? I think it's pretty certain at this point in time, we're pretty sure that we are undoing creation, certainly since the industrial age. Things have been changing pretty radically since the industrial age started. And creation is in fact being undone in it, and we're experiencing it in the form of climate change, global warming, things like that. What's important to understand is that the ancient Hebrews, they did do things like clear-cut forests. Solomon is known for doing that. And that probably had some environmental consequences at the time. But it's important to understand that the ancient Israelites would look at the things that were going on around them and interpret them in terms of this integral relationship between themselves, God's creation, and God. And then they would come to an understanding that it was God would be undoing this. God would be letting go of this tohu vavohu only for a moment in response to human infidelity to covenant or something like that. So it's a particular way of thinking that's our way of thinking about it is very different than it was for the ancient Israelites. And that's another thing that I hope to be able to emphasize tonight and also next time. All right, let's go ahead and move into the Psalms. What I want to do tonight is talk a little bit about the Psalms and kind of convey some general information about the Psalms, because the Psalms are an important part of the Hebrew Bible, and eventually move into some particular Psalms, some of them that are specifically have to do with creation. So just generally speaking, the book of Psalms in the Hebrew Bible is Israel's prayer book. Most scholars think that it was compiled around 4 BC near the end of the Persian period. Some of the Psalms may come from the period of the United Monarchy, or at least they recall that period. Other Psalms reflect Exodus and the patriarchal period, or more likely they recall that period. Some other Psalms are very personal Psalms, reflecting an individual's prayers, laments, or praises. The book of Psalms is an anthology. It's a collection of Psalms collected over time. The Psalms have always been associated with King David, probably to valorize the collection. Most scholars are pretty sure we don't know who composed them. Psalms have been categorized by good German biblical scholarship of a biblical scholar named Hermann Gunkel at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century. He identified what's called in German the Sitzenleben, or the situation in life of each of the Psalms. In other words, when you read the Psalm, you can situate it into a particular sort of experience that the praying person praying that Psalm might be in, or the praying group might be in. So from Gunkel's work, we understand there to be different kinds of Psalms. And just comment on the image here. This is an image from the St. John's Bible, one of the illuminations on Psalm 107. The different kinds of Psalms include individual and communal laments. As a matter of fact, that's the majority of the Psalms in the book of Psalms are lament Psalms. Some of the Psalms are hymns to divine kingship. Some are to creation, and others celebrate Yahweh's action in Israel's life. Some of the Psalms are clearly liturgical, meant to be uttered within the context of worship by a worshiping community. And interestingly, Psalms 15 and 24 actually have Q&A in them, almost like a sort of catechisms. Two very interesting Psalms. There are royal Psalms, some that have the king as a speaker or that simply deal with the king as the subject. There are also Jerusalem Psalms or Zion hymns. There are also pilgrimage Psalms that were probably sung and prayed by a group traveling to a sacred place, probably and especially to Jerusalem. There's also wisdom Psalms that deal with issues of human existence, and there's Torah Psalms that focus on divine law or teaching, and they're probably referring when the Torah Psalms utter the word Torah, what they're probably referring to is the Pentateuch, the entire first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. Now, what I want to do is kind of move from just a general description of the different types of Psalms to a way of seeing or looking at the Psalms. Old Testament theologian Walter Brueggemann, back in 1980, published the article that you see up on the screen. He eventually composed a book out of it called The Message of the Psalms. What Brueggemann noticed was that when you read the Psalms, somewhat similar to what Gunkel was doing with the situations in life, but when Brueggemann reads the Psalms, he's able to categorize them or to fit them into kind of a schematic. Now, the schematic was based on Brueggemann's reading of a French philosopher named Paul Ricoeur, who wrote about the different experiences of life, the ebb and flow of life and living. And Brueggemann is able to apply this to the Psalms. And I'm introducing it to everybody because I do it with all of my Old Testament students, but it's also a really helpful way to understand how the Psalms fit into ancient Israel's life, but also how they might fit into our own. The categories are Psalms of orientation, Psalms of disorientation, and Psalms of new orientation. And what's really valuable about this is that it honestly reflects lived life and the lived life of Israel. So Psalms of orientation. These are Psalms that reflect comfort, reliability, orderliness, familiarity, balance, and integrity. And there's a number of them. In these Psalms, life's issues are sure and settled. These Psalms are expressions of creation faith, many even without mentioning creation or elements of the creation like trees, mountains, sky, or animal. But they are creation faith Psalms because they talk about order. These are elementally creation Psalms because they evince a cosmos ordered by Yahweh and affirm Yahweh's fidelity, Yahweh's continuity, and Yahweh's generosity. So those are Psalms of orientation. And there are Psalms of disorientation. Now, these Psalms reflect dislocation, discomfort, recollection of the good old days when God was doing what God's supposed to do, imbalance, unreliability, inconsistency, abandonment, and absence. Now, according to Brueggemann, Psalms of disorientation are intended to evoke a reality for someone who is engaged in denial, a self-deception that life is well ordered even though it is not. So Psalms of disorientations are invitations to wake up to reality. Now, the church has typically avoided these psalms, but at a great cost. And the reason why the church avoids these psalms in its liturgies is because these psalms lead believers into the presence of God where everything is not polite and civil. The church avoids these psalms too because in these psalms, when these psalms are uttered, believers are thinking unthinkable thoughts, and they say unimaginable things to God through the psalm. But these psalms offer believers honest expressions that match real life experience. They are faithful expressions. It's important to understand they emerge within the context of faith. Faithful expressions of honesty, uttered within the context of a covenantal relationship. This sort of honesty, something Western cultures and so Western Christianity typically tries to avoid, preferring instead to proclaim that a life of faith should be filled with joy, constancy, and certitude. But this is not what one finds in the Old Testament, let alone in the book of Psalms. And what I want to do is read one of the disorientation psalms. And some of you might be familiar with this, but this is a very interesting psalm. Now, what I'll do, I'll just read it and I'll just offer just a little bit of comment about it. Psalm 88. O Lord, my God, I call for help by day. I cry out in the night before you. Let my prayer come before you. Incline your ear to my cry. My soul is full of troubles, and my life draws near to Sheol. I am reckoned among those who go down to the pit. I am a man who has no strength, like one forsaken among the dead, like the slain that lie in the grave, like those whom you remember no more, for they are cut off from your hand. You have put me in the depths of the pit, in the regions of dark and deep. Your wrath lies heavy upon me, and you overwhelm me with all your waves. You have caused my companions to shun me. You have made me a thing of horror to them. I am shut in so that I cannot escape. My eye grows dim through sorrow. Every day I call upon you, O Lord. I spread out my hands to you. Do you work wonders for the dead? Do the shades rise up to praise you? Is your mercy declared in the grave, or your faithfulness in Abaddon? Are your wonders known in the darkness, or your saving help in the land of forgetfulness? But I, O Lord, cry to you. In the morning my prayer comes before you. O Lord, why do you cast me off? Why do you hide your face from me? Afflicted and close to death from my youth, I suffer your terrors. I am helpless. Your wrath has swept over me. Your dread assaults destroy me. They surround me like a flood all day long and close in upon me together. You have caused loved one and friend to shun me. My companions are in darkness. The word of the Lord, thanks be to God. Now that's a tough psalm. Two things that I think are really important to notice about this psalm. Number one is that there's no mention on the part of the one praying the psalm of sin or committing any kind of sin. This psalm is simply about the absence of God. And this psalm, unlike a lot of the other lament psalms, does not end with a recollection of God's faithfulness or some kind of utterance of assurance that God will rally and rescue. This is a very interesting psalm that's harsh, but it's a psalm that has to do with real life and real experience. Now, the third kind of psalm that Brueggemann identifies are psalms of new orientation. These are typically hymns or songs of thanksgiving. They reflect thanksgiving and rescue. They utter a joyful new situation or transformation. Some kind of transformation is uttered in the psalm from a place of disorientation to one of new orientation. Now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and read a psalm of orientation. And this is a very well-known creation psalm. I'm going to read the whole thing. These are observations. These observations that I make on Psalm 104 come from biblical scholars like Elizabeth Johnson, James Mays, Patrick Miller, and especially Ken Stone. So what I want to do is move through the psalm by sections, and this is the entire outline here. Let me go ahead and start. O Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with honor and majesty, who cover yourself with light as with a garment, who have stretched out the heavens like a tent, who have laid the beams of your chambers on the waters, who make the clouds your chariots, who ride on the wings of the wind, who make the winds your messengers, fire and flame your ministers. You set the earth on its foundations so that it should never be shaken. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they took to flight. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place which you appointed for them. You set a boundary which they should not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. So what we have here in this part of this psalm of orientation, this creation psalm, these first 9 verses, is creation. This is a psalm of creation. It starts with a description in poetry, a poetic description of God creating the cosmos. Now, the next section, verses 10 through 26 of Psalm 104, this is a catalog of all the living things that God has created, their habitations, their spaces, and their times. Now, I'm going to have a lot to say about this section because this is the heart of this particular psalm. You make springs gush forth in the valleys. They flow between the hills. They give drink to every beast of the field. The wild donkeys quench their thirst. Let me catch up here. The wild donkeys quench their thirst. By them, the birds of the air have their habitation, and they sing among the branches. From your lofty abode, you water the mountains. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of your work. You cause the grass to grow for cattle and plants for man to cultivate, that he may bring forth food from the earth and wine to gladden the heart of man, oil to make his face shine, and bread to strengthen man's heart. The trees of the Lord are watered abundantly, the cedars of Lebanon, which he planted. In them the birds build their nests. The stork has her home in the fir trees. The high mountains are for the wild goats. The rocks are for the hyrax. You have made the moon to mark the seasons. The sun knows its time for setting. You make darkness, and it is night, when all the beasts of the forest creep forth. Young lions roar for their prey, seeking their food from God. When the sun rises, they get them away and lie down in their dens. Man goes forth to his work and to his labor until the evening. O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. Yonder is the sea, great and wide, which teems with things innumerable, both living things, both small and great. There go the ships. And Leviathan, which he formed to sport in it. So what is unusual about the psalm compared to the creation narratives we looked at last Thursday is that in this articulation, this poetic articulation of creation, all living things live dependent on each other, or to use the language of Pope Francis, integrally. Land and sea animals, including humans, plants, lands, and seas, all things are interrelated in the great web of the works of the Lord. This psalm displays a vast, sprawling mesh of interconnection without a definite center, except Yahweh, the Creator, at the center. The different terrains, mountains, valleys, seas, springs, streams, fields of grass, the spaces and places and different times, day and night, are designated by God for animals. Trees for birds, mountains for wild goats, rocks for hyraxes, nighttime for creeping things and lions, and daytime for humans to do their work. Now, the explicitness of the description of spaces and times for animals runs contrary to the assumption that any space and place on earth is available for humans to move into, exploit, or otherwise infringe upon and displace other animals, destroying their space and place. So Psalm 104 asserts that some spaces are for animals and not for humans, but there are spaces for humans and times for humans. Now, verses 27 to 30 articulate all living things' dependence on Yahweh. And I want to read this, and I'm going to revisit some Hebrew vocabulary as I'm reading along with it. Verse 27, start there. These all look to you to give them their food in due season. When you give to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are filled with good things. When you hide your face, they are dismayed. When you take away their, in Hebrew, ruach, they die and return to dust. When you send forth your ruach, they are created, and you renew the face of the earth. Remember ruach from last Thursday in the first and second creation narrative. That's the Hebrew word that can be translated breath, wind, or spirit. So Yahweh, in this part of the text, well, this part of the text exclaims that God provides food for all things. All the animals, all human beings too, look for their sustenance from God. The presence of God's breath or spirit, ruach, recalls Genesis 1-3, where God's spirit was present over the primordial waters and was what gave life to all living things. All living things are dismayed when God is not attentive, and all things die when God renews God's ruach. God's ruach, when it returns, and they are created again, the animals, God renews the face of the earth. Now, the last part of the psalm is very interesting. May the glory of the Lord endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in his works, who looks on the earth and it trembles, who touches the mountains and they smoke. I will sing to the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praise to my God while I have being. May my meditation be pleasing to him, for I rejoice in the Lord. Let sinners be consumed by the earth, and let the wicked be no more. Bless the Lord, O my soul, praise the Lord. So with this section, this very interesting section, first it articulates a proper response to God's creation, that is, doxology, or praise. But verse 35a seems to come as a surprise. I'll read that again. Let sinners be consumed from the earth, and let the wicked be no more. It stands out. It shocks a lot of people. Well, when you look at this particular verse in its literary context, the warning against sinners, that is humans not keeping covenant, is likely directed at those who mistreat God's creation and creatures. One theologian put it this way: sinners in Psalm 104 are those who interfere with God's good provision for each creature, who tear down the trees in which the bird sings, and who destroy Leviathan playing in the ocean, who poke holes in the heavenly tent, who let loose the forces of nature that God brought under control at the very beginning of creation. This verse 35a is the only part of this psalm that imagines human beings apart and separate from the rest of the creation. All the other places that mention human beings, they are right there with the animals, created among them and living among them integrally. There is no human exceptionalism, so to speak, in this creation poetry, as there was in Genesis 1-3, except in this articulation that human sin can undo God's creation. So this psalm that beautifully describes the integral creation of all things and humans with it, at the last warns against the undoing of creation by human sin. When humans sin against creation, the creation is somehow undone. As in the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 12, verse 4, it says this: how long will the land mourn and the vegetation of the field dry up? Because of the wickedness of those who live in it, the animals and birds are swept away. And the prophet Hosea in chapter 4, when after he utters a warning against human covenant breaking, he says this: therefore the earth mourns, and everything that lives on it withers. Also the living creatures of the field and the birds of the skies and even the fish of the sea are disappearing. So that's a psalm of orientation that is important because it describes human beings as intricately interconnected in a different way than the first two creation narratives in Genesis 1 and 1-3 articulated. In this creation poetry, human beings are part and parcel with all the creation, with their own space, place, and their own time. And the animals have their own space, place, and time as well. All right, that's a psalm of orientation. I want to move to another psalm. And the reason why I chose this one is because it embodies both disorientation into new orientation. It's Psalm 77. This is not per se a creation psalm, but because it's a new orientation, it does line up with the other as a creation psalm, because it has to do with a new ordering on the part of God. So what I want to do is move through this psalm through sections. If you have your Bible, you can open up to Psalm 77, and you can follow along with me. The first part, verses 1-2, let me read that. I cry aloud to God, that he may hear me. In the day of my trouble, I seek the Lord. In the night, my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. So disorientation here is caused by an unhearing God. And the distress is, according to verse 2, it's inconsolable. The next part, verses 3 through 6. I think of God and I moan. I meditate and my spirit faints. You keep my eyelids from closing. I am so troubled that I cannot speak. I consider the days of old. I remember the years long ago. I commune with my heart in the night. I meditate and search my spirit. Notice the self-preoccupation over and over again with the personal pronoun I. So the person or the psalmist in the experience, the honest experience of disorientation because of an unhearing God. Again, I see no evidence in this psalm of admission of sin or even covenant breaking, just an unhearing God, where the psalmist's attention is turned inward, turned in on itself. That often happens in our experiences of disorientation. The next few verses. Will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Has his steadfast love forever ceased? Are his promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger shut up his compassion? Hard questions that the psalmist is raising. And then we come to a pivotal part of the psalm. And I say, it is my grief that the right hand of the Most High has changed. The right hand of the Most High has changed. God has changed. This is a pivotal verse expressing God's absolute freedom. God has changed. The covenantal relationship that all psalms imply is not quid pro quo, but fluid and sometimes, disappointingly, even surprising. The dislocating experience of God's unpredictability and utter freedom is on offer in this psalm. Now, the next section marks the turn, or the beginning of the turn in this psalm. It starts with the psalmist remembering the deeds of the Lord. I will call to mind the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your wonders of old. I will meditate on all your work and muse on your mighty deeds. The next section, verses 13 to 15. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? You are the God who works wonders, who have manifested your might among the peoples. With your arm, you redeemed your people, the sons of Jacob and Joseph. So notice the disappearance of the personal pronoun I after verse 12. The focus shifts from me to the other in the covenantal relationship, to Yahweh and to the works of God. This is the crucial move of this psalm. It's a move from disorientation to a new orientation, and it involves the relinquishing of self, the unselfing of oneself that transforms. This is the essence of covenant keeping in the Hebrew Bible. This does run counter to our narcissistic consumer culture that tells us to self-assert for our own benefit and our own satiation. Let's go ahead and finish up with the psalm. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Yes, the deep trembled. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth thunder. Your arrows flash on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lighted up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. The psalm ends with Yahweh's way in saving Israel was through the threatening waters of the Red Sea. that's a place of disorientation. What's interesting is that there is no return here to Egypt. So, by way of summary for tonight's presentation, human sinfulness, according to Genesis 1, is characterized by a fundamental self-centeredness. Different types of psalm. There are different types of psalms for different types of occasions. Walter Brueggemann has suggested looking at the psalms by the schematic orientation, disorientation, and new orientation. Orientation psalms are fundamentally creation psalms. The orientation Psalm 104 asserts a thoroughly integral ecology, imagining human beings not as having dominion, but as an integral part of God's creation. Psalm 104 asserts that human sin, or self-assertion, is capable of undoing God's creation. Disorientation to new orientation, Psalm 77, suggests that when humans unself themselves, which is the heart of covenant keeping, transformation into a new orientation is possible. Now, the next time I'm going to move into the wisdom literature and the book of Job, and portions of the book of Job that are chock full of, in my opinion, the most beautiful creation poetry in the entire Hebrew Bible. But also, what is at the heart of the book of Job is the whole idea of unselfing oneself. And also, I'll be tying all of this back to portions of Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si. So that's all I have tonight. Just out of duty, those are the images used by permission and selected bibliography. So at this time, I'm going to invite Mike to come back. And if there are any questions that folks might have, Mike, remember, if there are some questions because of our sound difficulties, you got to yell them to me so I can hear you.
Can do. Thank you so much, Jack. I appreciate your insightful reflection on the Psalms. And yeah, again, we're opening up for questions now. So if anyone would like to ask anything of Jack, either about today's presentation or even last week's, if there was anything lingering, you're welcome to ask that now. Again, there's two ways to do so. You can ask through the chat feature located at the very bottom of your screen. If you click on chat, it'll allow you to communicate with us as panelists. You're also able to ask a question through Q&A. So if anyone has a question, you're welcome to enter it and we'll address it. All right, Jack. Well, I'm not seeing any questions at this time.
Okay. Well, if folks do think of a question that they want to ask, they're certainly welcome to contact me at Flagler College. If you just Google my name at Flagler College, you'll easily find the faculty page in the directory there.
Oh.
All right.
All right. Actually, we do have one question, if you've got time. This question begins with a comment that this was a beautiful overview of the Psalms, but it brings forth sorrow when considering that at this time, the earth is on fire. And I think directly referring to the West Coast, much of which is cut up in some unquenchable fires there, and a lot of people moving and suffering. Can you offer consolation?
Well, rather than offer consolation, the way that I would suggest that the viewer think about what's going on out on the West Coast, which I've seen the pictures, I saw some of the pictures today, and it's pretty striking. one of the things that most scholars and theologians have learned by studying the Psalms is that the Psalms actually encourage, rather than discourage, disconsolation. Um, so I raise that as a suggestion to anyone, and I include myself among people that are feel in the need of some kind of consolation from what is going on with the earth and what's going on right now out on our West Coast. Spending some time, there is a purpose, there's a reason to spend some time in the disorientation. As a matter of fact, something that I do like to remind folks, and Mike, you should remember this too, is when I talk about the story of Exodus, you can actually outline the book of Exodus in terms of orientation, disorientation, and new orientation. So you have those three stages. You have the time of orientation, where the Israelites are in Egypt. They're well fed, they're happy, they know what's going to happen today, you know they're going to get fed, etc. Then all this business with Moses and the Egyptians, and they find themselves and they're shoved into the wilderness of disorientation. The wilderness is a place of danger in the ancient world. But what's important is that it's in the very center of that journey, chapter 19 in the book of Exodus, on a mountain, where the Israelites, through Moses, experienced their decisive encounter with Yahweh. It's not back in Egypt, where things are settled and certain, and it's not in the promised land. But the most decisive point in the story is right in the middle of disorientation, where they encounter God. So somehow in this encounter, in our experience, we might look for ways to encounter the divine in the midst of our need for consolation, rather than seeking to get out of it so quickly.
Beautiful. Thank you, Jack.
All right.
All right. So that should do it.
Okay. Well, thanks again, everybody. Hope to see you next week when we talk about wisdom literature. Thank you, Mike.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jack. Thank you, everyone.
Have a great night.